Warhammer Fantasy is back, but should it be? Hello, my name is Chris and this is Build, Paint, Game. Unless you've been under a rock somewhere taking a very long nap, you won't have escaped your attention that Games Workshop has re-released Warhammer Fantasy, except this time they're calling it The Old World. Back in 2015, Games Workshop released a series of books to move their fantasy line along. These were aptly called The End Times. They focused initially on Nagash and his rise and return to the Old World as it was known, and then moved on to other great powers coming forth in what was one climactic battle that shattered the Old World and in effect caused chaos to win. Also, much to many players and enthusiasts' surprise as well, this really was the end of the Old World and Warhammer Fantasy as a whole. Then, almost immediately, Games Workshop released Age of Sigmar. It came out with one page of rules, very little fluff and lore for people to enjoy, just a brief explanation of what this setting was and how it related and had progressed from Warhammer Fantasy. And it came out with a brand new faction, the Stormcast Eternals. You could still use your old models. Some factions had disappeared, but as long as you rebased your models onto a round base, there was some basic rules for you to use them. It was almost as though Games Workshop was trying to make this so simple that anyone could play, using just about any model they want. The new Stormcast Eternals even looked just like Space Marines. They were wide, big shoulder pads, fully encased in armour. From these humble beginnings, Age of Sigmar has grown. It is now in its third edition. The Space Marine copies that were the Stormcast are no longer just Space Marine copies. They're very close, but now they look much different. They're not as bulky, they're slimmer. They look like their own thing. But the destruction of the old lore of Warhammer Fantasy and the removal of it as a game and the replacement of Age of Sigmar caused anger amongst fans. Why had Games Workshop done this? Well, for me, I think there were two reasons. The first reason is that Warhammer Fantasy was effectively a Tolkien world copy. There was nothing particularly unique. The characters were unique, but it was a world filled with elves and orcs, set in a typical fantasy world. So, Games Workshop had recently been through a number of court cases and they were determined to preserve their IP. So they needed to wipe away anything that couldn't be copyrighted and come up with something that, although taking from other inspirations, was not the same as a Tolkien and general fantasy. Secondly, I don't think Games Workshop was seeing the sales that they'd come to expect, having seen the astronomical turnover that Warhammer 40,000 could do. Warhammer Fantasy doesn't seem, in my opinion, and from what I've kind of gleaned from the hobby at that time, that they were doing the number of sales that Games Workshop were hoping for. Therefore, perhaps if they released a game, a fantasy game, that was more in line with Warhammer 40,000 and the way that worked, that would produce the revenue that they were hoping for. Whatever the reasons, Warhammer Fantasy players split into a few camps. You had people who went along with Age of Sigmar, but were going to use initially their own models. They rebased them onto round bases and they got stuck in with the limited rules that were available. You had the Rage Quitters. These were people who were like, absolutely not. You've taken away Warhammer Fantasy. I am going to just sell my army and have absolutely nothing to do with you, Games Workshop. You also had quite a group of people who decided to keep their armies. They'd got the rule books, they'd got the models, they were going to keep playing. What more did they need? They'd got Games Workshop had provided over years everything you needed to play. Models, which they'd spent hours painting, various rule sets because there had been many editions of Warhammer Fantasy, so pick the one that you prefer. And they continued playing, and they still play to this day. Now, Warhammer Fantasy is back and renamed The Old World. This allows it to sit comfortably with Age of Sigmar, a little bit like the Horus Heresy sits with Warhammer 40,000. But for me, this leaves me with some questions. The first, and quite possibly most important question for me personally, is who is this for? If you're someone passionate about Warhammer Fantasy, you've probably already got an army, maybe multiple. You've been playing this whole time. You don't need to pick up any new models. And if you're not picking up new models, what's Games Workshop going to do with you? If you're a new hobbyist trying to get into a fantasy setting by Games Workshop, you've probably gone for Age of Sigmar anyway, because there's more models, they're newer, they're plastic. It's more obvious from Games Workshop's marketing that this is their main fantasy product. The only people that I see this appealing to is people who were in the hobby. Maybe they were playing Warhammer 40,000 or not even a Games Workshop game at all, back when Warhammer Fantasy was around. Or maybe they were young and they couldn't afford to get into it but they wanted to. They've got a little bit of nostalgia, and now that these are being released, they can finally get back in to Warhammer Fantasy as they remembered when they were younger. The second question I have is, how well is Games Workshop going to support the Old World? We only have 2 factions so far, and they seem to be made up of just re-releases of what was already there, with 1 or 2 characters or models thrown in that are new. Something that concerns me is that the range isn't full plastic as well, and this tends to be a sign that Games Workshop doesn't want to invest in the plastic moulds for them, and this is usually due to the fact that they're not predicting high sales. My third question is, where is this all going? Because much like the Horus Heresy, we already know how the Old World ends. Therefore, what can they add? They can tell stories in that time period, they can add new characters, but they can't really bring in much in the way of new factions. Therefore, is it just going to be a rehash and a re-release with the odd new character of what already existed? In which case, why? I hope that those of you who are excited about Warhammer The Old World are really excited and are enjoying the release. However, I don't know how often they're going to release stuff for this. I think it's going to be pretty far and few between, to be honest. It's going to take a long time for them to produce everything. And what support are they going to give in the future to the Old World? Ultimately, it will be sales that dictate what Games Workshop do. Hopefully this won't end up like the Cursed City, where they release a core set and we get nothing for ages, and then it just kind of drops and drifts away with no explanation. But it's a great IP that has already existed. There is clearly a fan base for it because it sold out on the day. I guess the main question for me though is, who is Warhammer The Old World aimed at? I get the nostalgia element, but beyond that I don't know who Games Workshop is targeting with this new product. Let me know your thoughts about Warhammer The Old World down in the comments. If you've made it this far through the video, thank you for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe and all that good stuff. It really helps the channel. And if you're looking for something else to watch, why not click on one of the videos that's on your screen.